Statistically speaking, the Wild West wasn't quite as wild as pop culture would have us believe, but it wasn't without its tragedies. Quick draw duels and saloon brawls might catch our imagination, yet the real violence was far more devastating. And it often struck entire nations of people who had lived on that land for centuries. Behind the myths of rugged cowboys and gleaming gold rush towns lies a story of forced marches, broken promises, and families torn from the soil that held their ancestors' bones. This was the fate of Native Americans whose homelands became bargaining chips in a relentless game of expansion. Treaties promised them security, only to be torn up when the settlers demanded more land. What followed was not adventure, but exile. Thousands pushed onto barren reservations left to starve in, places where crops could not grow. The most infamous of these journeys became known as the Trail of Tears, where snow, hunger, and disease claimed countless lives. And while we might like to think we'd be among the ones who survived the Wild West, the truth is harsher. If you were a Cherokee child on that march, or a Lakota elder on a reservation, survival wasn't about courage. It was about enduring the impossible. Yes, you would have died in the Wild West, not by bullet or snake bite, but by the slow grinding weight of displacement. But before we dive deeper into this hidden chapter of frontier history, be sure to subscribe to the Sleepy Historian tonight. After that, drop a comment and let us know what other corners of Wild West life you'd like to see uncovered. Okay, partners, saddle up. This ride takes us down a path the movies never show. When the United States expanded westward, it did so with pen in one hand and rifle in the other. Government officials came to tribal councils with documents called treaties, promising peace and permanent homelands if native peoples would only give up their ancestral territories. To the chiefs who signed, land was not just real estate. It was sacred. Hunting grounds passed down by ancestors, burial places of loved ones, rivers that carried stories as old as time itself. Yet on paper, those lands were traded away for vague guarantees of protection and supplies. The problem was simple. Very few of those treaties lasted. Each time white settlers wanted more land for farms, towns, or the glittering lure of gold, the government tore up its old agreements and wrote new ones. To tribes, it felt like trying to grasp water with bare hands. Every time they reached for security, it slipped away. Officials spoke of fairness, but soldiers stood nearby to remind the chiefs what refusal meant. In reality, treaties were little more than polite disguises for conquest. For Native Americans, this was the first act in a tragedy. They were trapped in a cycle: surrender land, sign an agreement, lose it again, and face another demand. The promises of forever turned out to last only until the next wave of settlers arrived. Slowly, piece by piece, the heart of Native America was carved away, and the stage was set for one of history's darkest marches. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes knew the cruelty of broken treaties all too well. In the 1830s, under President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, they were forced to abandon their homelands in the lush forests of the Southeast. Soldiers drove them westward toward the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. It was winter. Families carried what little they could. Mothers wrapped children in thin blankets. The elderly stumbled barefoot through mud and snow. Hunger gnawed at them as rations ran short and sickness spread like wildfire. Along the endless miles, graves began to dot the path, small mounds of earth where loved ones had fallen and could go no further. This became known as the Trail of Tears, and the name is not exaggeration. Over 16,000 Cherokees began the journey. Thousands never finished it. Entire clans were erased in the cold wind. Witnesses remembered frozen corpses by the roadside, horses collapsing from exhaustion, soldiers prodding survivors onward with bayonets. For those who lived, grief became a permanent companion. They had lost not only their land but also their families and sense of belonging. To the United States, it was a victory of policy. To the native peoples, it was the death of a world. Arriving at their so-called new homes, Native Americans found not fertile valleys but wastelands. Reservations, plots of land set aside for them, were often barren, rocky, or remote. Rivers were scarce, soil was poor, and the game that once filled forests and plains was gone. For a people whose lives had always been tied to the land, this was a slow suffocation. The government issued rations, but corruption meant supplies rarely reached those in need. Food was spoiled, clothing was inadequate, medicine almost non-existent. Starvation was common. Entire communities, once self-sufficient hunters and farmers, became dependent on handouts that arrived late or not at all. Diseases like smallpox and measles ripped through the weakened populations. Reservations were not just physical spaces, they were prisons for the spirit. Boundaries kept Native Americans from roaming, hunting, or practicing traditional lifeways. Soldiers patrolled the borders, reminding them that escape meant punishment. For a people who had once ridden freely across the Great Plains, the reservation was a cruel paradox, a wide-open land that felt smaller than a cell. Losing land was only half the story. The other half was the war against culture itself. By the late 19th century, the U.S. government turned to assimilation. The plan was brutal: strip Native people of their languages, traditions, and beliefs, until nothing remained. Native children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, often hundreds of miles away. There they had their hair cut short, were forced into uniforms, and forbidden to speak their own languages. Teachers drilled them in Christianity, English grammar, and manual labor. If a child whispered in Lakota, Navajo, or Cherokee, punishment was swift. A beating or days of silence in solitary rooms. The motto was chilling: kill the Indian, save the man. It meant destroying everything native within a child and replacing it with the ways of the dominant culture. Some children never came home at all, buried in unmarked graves behind the schools. For those who survived, the trauma lasted lifetimes. They returned to their families, strangers, unable to pray in the old ways, ashamed of their heritage, caught between two worlds that rejected them. Through this, entire cultures tatered on, the brink of extinction, not just from bullets or hunger, but from forced forgetting. Not all Native Americans submitted quietly. Leaders rose, determined to defend their people against impossible odds. Among them were Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse of the Lakota, who resisted U.S. expansion onto the northern plains. Their warriors delivered one of the most stunning defeats in American military history at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where General Custer and his men were annihilated. Farther south, the Apache leader Geronimo waged a relentless guerrilla war, evading thousands of soldiers with only a handful of followers. His cunning and ferocity became legend. For years, he refused to surrender, living off the desert and striking when least expected. But such victories were temporary. The U.S. Army's numbers, weapons, and resources were overwhelming. Resistance was met with massacres, Wounded Knee, in 1890 being the most infamous, where hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children were slaughtered in the snow. The message was clear: fight and you die, surrender and you lose everything anyway. Despite the crushing odds, these leaders etched their names into history. They became symbols of defiance, proof that even in the face of annihilation, the human spirit refuses to bow without a fight. By the dawn of the 20th century, Native America had been reshaped beyond recognition. Reservations dotted the map, each one a reminder of stolen homelands. Languages had been silenced, sacred rituals outlawed, children torn from their families. What had once been hundreds of sovereign nations was now reduced to marginalized communities struggling for survival. The legacy of displacement still lingers. Poverty rates on reservations remain among the highest in the United States. Alcoholism, unemployment, and suicide afflict native populations at alarming levels. Many communities still lack access to clean water, proper health care, or quality education. These are not just modern statistics, they are the shadows of history. And yet, survival itself is a form of victory. Across North America, tribes are reclaiming their languages, reviving ceremonies, and teaching children the stories that were nearly erased. Elders remind the young, we are still here. What the government tried to destroy persists in song, dance, prayer, and memory. For the American frontier myth, the West is a place of freedom and opportunity. For Native Americans, it remains the graveyard of promises, a landscape of loss. The displacement was not just the theft of land, it was the attempted erasure of a people. But against all odds, they endure.